Great. Well, I think we will go ahead and get started here. Uh, Good morning, everyone. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Heather Elmer, Director of Sugar and River Watershed Partners, and I'm a member of the Central Lake Erie Basin Collaborative Steering Committee. Glad that you could all join us this morning for our quarterly network meeting. We have a great agenda tied up here today. We're thrilled to have Emily Arthur with the Ohio Environmental Council joining us for a training on navigating federal and state funding, as well as Helena Volser of the Alliance for the Great Lakes for a presentation and discussion on data centers. Because of the jam-packed agenda, great things we have online here this morning, we're going to have just a streamlined introductions and icebreaker and we'll jump into that in a second. Before we do that, just want to remind everyone that we have a set of core values and guiding principles that guide our time together. That we're all here voluntarily and participate in the network by choice, and that we operate under the principles of accountability, transparency, uh, open, regular communication and consensus. And just like to review that at the beginning of our regular meetings. And with that, let's jump into our abbreviated introductions and icebreaker. So if everyone could just take a minute or two and within the chat, share your name and organization and a word to describe your day so far. Great. It looks like a lot of us are experiencing sun this morning. A few folks might be having some rain, and some of us have been pretty busy. So looks like we're um, gentle. That's a great way to describe a day. That's a good day to have, I think. Um, And there's another person awakening, Laura DeYoung with Greenprint Solutions. But yes, looks like we have a great turnout here. Soil and water conservation districts, a number of watershed organizations and other conservation organizations that participate in the network. And really excited to jump into our first session, which is the first in a four-part training series that Laura Bennell of Chagrin River Watershed Partners has organized in partnership with Emily Arthur of Ohio Environmental Council. And these trainings are supported through a partnership with Old Woman Creek National Estuarine Research Reserve. So if you haven't had a chance to register for the entire series, they're all listed up there on the slide. And we'll be kicking off today's workshop with Money, 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 Navigating Federal and State Funding. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura and Emily.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, I'll just be really quick. Yeah, we're very excited to have Emily here today for the first session in this four-part training series. So we don't really have a registration. We just kind of had an RSVP, and we would welcome you to share that Google form link out with anyone who you think might be interested in these trainings. So they don't have to be all done. It's great if you can do them all, but if you can just do one of them or two of them, that's fine too. So the next two sessions will be in person, and so definitely want to fill the room. and everything like that. So there would be really great training. So yeah, feel free to forward them on, and just we can track participation by that Google form. The next one will be Policy 101, Navigating Language, the Lay of the Land, and Acceptable Roles. This will give organizations a chance to figure out what they can and can't do based on what type of organization you work for, and also give you some ideas on how to engage in the policy process. So this will be on Monday, April 20th. I think we have about 15 people signed up so far, probably a little bit more, but we can get up to, I think, about 30 or more. So feel free to share. And then sessions 3 and 4 will be combined, also in person. That will be in May, and I'm still trying to find a location for that. But I think there'll be really good training sessions. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And I will, yes, Meg, I will share the information again with you all here today, in just a Google form, like I said, just so we could sort of track who's coming, and then I can also, share information out as we get closer to those training dates. So without further ado, I'll pass it along to Emily Arthur. Thanks so much, Emily, for being here, and looking forward to learning more.
Thank you. I will pull up my slides here. Hmm. Use effect. Ready? And here we are. Okay. Thank you for joining and for that introduction. I'll just introduce myself, Emily Arthur, and I have received my bachelor's in biology from Bowling Green State University and master's in environmental science from Unity College. I have a background in water quality sampling for the ODNR and managing a marina on Lake Erie before entering the advocacy space with various organizations across Northern Ohio. I have been with Ohio Environmental Council, or OEC, for 4 years in differing roles, and most recently as their agriculture and water manager, where I lead nutrient reduction policy, streams and wetlands protection, and federal water policy work. The mission of OEC is to protect the environment and health of all Ohio communities through legal and policy advocacy, decision maker accountability, and civic engagement. And thank you for joining this part one of the four-part training series with CLEB. Today, we're building a shared understanding of how restoration funding works, because timing, relationships, and readiness determines whether local projects get funded. By the end of this hour, you all will hopefully understand key local, state, and federal restoration funding sources, learn how budget cycles shape funding opportunities, identify when and how to engage lawmakers, and practice matching real projects to the right funding sources. And this is a training rather than a presentation, so please feel free to interact with the content as much as possible by coming off mute and asking questions at any time. I'll address the questions in the chat between content, and I'll also share the slides and a recording of the training following this meeting. We can jump in. Restoration funding in the water world isn't a single pipeline. It's a patchwork, and dollars move through different agencies, each with its own eligibility rules, timelines, and priorities. Some opportunities are cyclical and predictable. Others appear once and never return. Federal funds often pass through state agencies before they reach local communities, and along the way, the criteria can shift. On top of that, some programs distribute money competitively, while others use formulas that reward certain geographies or project types. This complexity isn't a sign that anyone is doing something wrong. Even seasoned practitioners struggle to keep track of all the moving pieces. And the goal today isn't for you to memorize every program. Instead, we want you to recognize the patterns, how funding flows, when decisions get made, and where your organization can plug in if you don't already know that. And here's the truth, restoration funding is fragmented and competitive, but it's not impenetrable. Success often comes down to timing, relationships, and project readiness, like I said previously. And club members can influence outcomes by engaging early, understanding the budget cycles, and positioning their projects before the window opens. When you know how the system works, you can navigate it with far more confidence and impact. When we talk about the funding landscape for watershed and restoration work, it helps to start with the sources closest to home and then zoom out to the larger federal picture. Each level of government, local, regional, state, and federal, plays a distinct role. Understanding these lanes helps groups quickly identify where to look depending on the type of project they're pursuing. When we think about how watershed and restoration work gets funded, it helps to picture a layered system. Each layer, local, regional, state, and federal, plays a different role, and each has its own strengths. The goal isn't to memorize every program, but to understand which lane is most likely to support the kind of work you're doing. At the local and regional levels, there's the county soil and water conservation districts, which a lot of you are familiar with, I'm sure. These are often the first stop for landowners, farmers, and community groups. Soil and water districts provide hands-on technical assistance, small grants, and cost share programs for erosion control, agricultural BMPs, habitat improvements, and more. And they're deeply connected to local needs and can help shape early project concepts. While municipal stormwater utilities are support green infrastructure, drainage improvements, flood mitigation, and maintenance of stormwater systems. For urban and suburban communities, stormwater utilities are a critical partner for water quality and resilience projects, especially those tied to runoff, flooding, or neighborhood scale green infrastructure. There's regional or metropolitan planning commissions, and these bodies coordinate regional watershed planning, prioritize projects, and distribute federal pass-through dollars. They are often tied to transportation, resilience, or water-related infrastructure, and they help ensure that local projects align with broader regional strategies. That can be powerful allies when you need multi-jurisdictional coordination or when a project needs to be elevated on a regional priority list. Finally, there's local foundations and community development funds, and these funders offer flexible, community-driven grants that can support environmental restoration, public access, education, and neighborhood-scale green infrastructure. They're especially valuable for early planning, community engagement, or pilot projects, and these kinds of activities that state and federal programs don't always cover. Oops. Moving to the state sources, H2 Ohio invests in wetlands, agricultural best management practices, drinking water and wastewater upgrades, and nutrient reduction projects. If you're restoring a wetland or implementing nutrient reduction practices, H2 Ohio is a top fit. There's also the state revolving funds, including in Ohio, their names Water Pollution Control Loan Fund and Drinking Water Assistance Fund, also known as the Clean Water SRF and the Drinking Water SRF. which are federal funding sources that flow through the state. And the Water Pollution Control Loan Fund provides low interest loans. Oh my goodness. Sorry about that. Okay. They're working on a house by me, and I think it's shaking my house. Okay. Yes. So there's also the Drinking Water Assistance Fund, which finances drinking water infrastructure improvements, including treatment upgrades, lead service line replacement, PFAS treatment, and system resilience. And if you're working on wastewater or stormwater infrastructure, this is a key program. If you're replacing water lines or upgrading drinking water systems, think SRF. There's also the ODNR and ODA conservation programs, which support habitat restoration, streams, and wetlands improvements, and agricultural conservation practices and land protection, often used for wildlife habitat, riparian buffers, and nutrient reduction projects on working lands. I want to highlight that state programs often prioritize shovel-ready projects and strong partnerships, and encourage you to build relationships with program staff early. And I see a question from Meg.
Hi, Emily, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I wanted to just ask a clarification on working lands for ODNR and ODA conservation programs. Are those typically defined as agricultural producers, or are there things in an urban and suburban environment that would qualify as well?
Typically, agricultural land, there's been sort of one-off funding programs for some of the urban and suburban in around expanding green spaces or increasing tree cover, but those are not standing funding programs.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
Anything else? Is there any questions or anything you're seeing that's new here? Move on then to federal funding sources. Once we zoom out to the federal level, each agency has a clear lane, a set of priorities and project types that they're best suited to fund. The GLRI funds habitat restoration, AOC cleanup, invasives, nutrient reduction, and community-led watershed projects across the Great Lakes Basin. There's also the USDA and NRCS programs, including EQIP, CSP, CREP, which I didn't list here, RCPP, and other NRCS programs at USDA, which support agricultural conservation practices. And it really focuses on technical assistance, especially for agricultural lands. If your work involves farmers, soil health, or best management practices, NRCS is a natural fit. If you're working with farmers, NRCS is definitely your lane. EPA supports restoration through Section 319, as well as GLRI and other water quality grants. These programs are strong options for non-point source pollution, habitat restoration, and community-based watershed work. GLRI is heavily relevant for Lake Erie and tributary restoration. And then there's the Army Corps of Engineer Ecosystem Restoration, which provides ecosystem restoration funding and planning assistance, especially for large scale or engineering heavy projects. These programs are well suited for coastal, riverine, or wetland restoration that requires engineering expertise. There's also NOAA, who invests in coastal resilience and habitat restoration, particularly in areas connected to the Great Lakes or coastal systems. Not as much these days, unfortunately, due to a lot of funding cuts at NOAA under this administration, specifically to research arms. And the EPA, we're also continuing to see cuts to staffing for a lot of these programs. And then there's also the Department of Transportation through the IIJA, if you're familiar with that one-off infrastructure funding source, but I didn't list it here because it is no longer active. And a key point is many federal dollars don't come directly from Washington. They flow through state agencies, regional planning bodies, or competitive grant programs. That's why relationships at the state and regional level matter just as much as understanding the federal programs themselves. And I'm going to check the chat here. Yes, Ivanka, I do see NOAA just did another staff cut. It's very unfortunate. Okay. We're feeling good about this. I do want to clarify which programs are recurring versus tied to specific budget cycles. Some funding streams like 319, SRFs, NRCS programs, and GLRI come back every year. They're part of the federal budget cycle, so you can plan around them. Others like H2 Ohio or one-time federal packages depend on state budgets or specific legislation. And that's why the landscape feels fragmented. Some pieces are stable and predictable, while others appear only when the political stars align, per se. Rather than chasing every opportunity, the goal is to think about alignment, matching the right project to the right funder. A few simple rules of thumb to make this easier: narrow your focus, save time, and build stronger, more competitive proposals are listed here. For example, if you're restoring a wetland, think H2 Ohio or GLRI. Replacing water lines, think SRF. If you're working with farmers, think NRCS. And I want to stress that funders want to see credibility and readiness, not perfection. Here are some steps you can identify to better prepare yourself for proposals, including a clear problem definition, evidence-based approach, strong partnerships, and more here. And thank you for your comment in the chat. Any other questions here? We will dive into this a little more in the breakout groups later. Okay, we'll move on to the Ohio budget timeline. You can advocate for these funding sources and your specific projects through the Ohio State Operating Budget. It takes part on odd years, so every other year. So I listed 2025 and 2027 there. And in February and March, in odd years, there's the governor introduces the budget. And then March to April, there's hearings and amendments in the House. May to June, there's hearing and amendments in the Senate. And late June, there's a conference committee convenes and passage of the budget. And so key engagement windows are December to February, mainly around lawmaker education for your funding sources or projects. And then March to May, when you can participate in hearings through providing testimony or sign-on letters. or a couple other tactics we'll talk about. But keeping your outreach regional specific or plugging into partner or groups that are in your target area is a lot more meaningful because the message then comes from a constituent or someone benefiting from the district of the lawmaker you're reaching out to. Here's just an example of one tactic that OEC, as well as Alliance of the Great Lakes, the Nature Conservancy, a lot of partners took place in organizing. And this was a sign-on letter to Governor DeWine, President McCauley, and Speaker Huffman that was asking to restore the funding levels to H2 Ohio. We also included some asks around specific H2 Ohio program parts that were being threatened. And we were able to receive over 50 organizations signed on to this. And we did an actual part 2 sign-on letter, and it was very effective. You can also use blogs, social media, action alerts, joint partner meetings with lawmakers, and more as tactics to engage in the budget cycle. Moving into the federal budget timeline, this is annual, and in February, the president's budget is published. And March through April, there's appropriations requests that take place and congressional hearings. May to June, there's appropriations markups, and summer, the floor votes on the budget. And then fall to winter, there's continuing resolutions and omnibus, which puts a lot of these funding pieces together into single packages and gives them the actual funding source, whether it be an agency or a program where the dollars are going to come from. The key engagement windows are February to March, when appropriations requests take place. There is also spring fly-ins like Great Lakes Day that we just participated in March. We also do one in the summer and one in the fall for last minute convincing and bringing less constituents and more targeted messaging during those times. If you're going to take a mail-in letter approach, I would be sure to also include it virtually to the member or staff to ensure timeliness. And appropriation request windows have been getting smaller and smaller, making it more difficult to fund requested projects. We at OEC just finished submitting appropriations requests and for some offices a 2-week window, which is very small. And appropriation requests are typically submitted between February and April each year after the president releases the budget. And members of Congress open their request portals in late February or early March, with deadlines often in March. And these requests must be submitted through your representatives or senators' online portals, following their specific forms and documentation requirements. If you cannot find their portal online, you can reach out to their staff to request it, or an organization like OEC to send it to you. And here's what we used for our appropriations request. We're lucky to be a part of Healing Our Waters that provides a lot of guidance and materials to help you through these processes. And it's also important to stay connected to the staff members in the offices. There tends to be a high turnover rate, but consistently touching base with them via email is helpful to provide updates and materials. So when to engage these lawmakers: before the budgets are drafted, during hearings and markups, when you're sharing local project impacts. So if there's a big project highlight, and then also during an implementation for tours and ribbon cuttings. And I encourage you to set up a simple tracking system using a spreadsheet or a shared doc. Consistency really beats complexity, and you can use sources like are listed here: grants.gov, agency listservs on the federal level, and program calendars on the state level, planning commissions on the regional level, and then peer networks as well that often give updates on these timings and when best to engage. And I've listed some of those there. Key takeaways is you don't need to chase every opportunity. It's okay to say no to opportunities that aren't a good fit. Relationships matter as much as applications. We were able to get a lot of projects in Southeast Ohio funding restored because we were able to reach out directly to those congressional members, highlighting during the time when all of those major cuts were happening, and highlight the importance, and they were able to advocate on our behalf for those funding sources. Also starting early and planning ahead, and using CLEB and peer networks that are tapped into these schedules. Funding is a long game, so just being aware of that. And the goal is confidence and clarity and not mastery of every program. And here's some prep questions you can ask yourself before shaping your funding proposals that helps align your messages and identify your funding source as well. Any questions on all of that before we break out into groups? And we'll have a couple scenarios that you can pick from in your group and discuss a couple questions, and then we'll kind of come back to the full group to report out. But I want to pause here. Any questions or comments? Okay. And like I said, these slides will be provided to you, might be helpful to look back at just because for the sake of time, I had to run through this. So we'll move on to our breakout activity. I will maybe pop in the chat the scenarios because I believe you can still see the chat when you break out into your groups. And I'll also pop these questions in there, but your group will choose a scenario that's in the chat, and then you will address these questions. Which funding source or sources is the best fit for the scenario? What timeline matters? Is it that state or federal timeline? And what strengthens the pitch? So looking at those questions and partnerships. And then when we come back, we will report out your project scenario that you've chosen, your recommended funding source or sources, and one insight or question. So we'll have about 10 minutes in our group and about 10 minutes to do report outs. Come back, everyone. I don't want to cut into Helena's wonderful presentation, so we'll do some quick share outs. I don't know if there's been assigned people in each group to share out, but I can go ahead and list a couple things that we shared. And hopefully everyone saw them. Apologies if there was some issues in getting those in the chat. Our group decided to do scenario D, City wants to install bioswales and permeable pavement in a flood-prone neighborhood. We discussed that likely there would be funding through the stormwater utility and SRF for this. Maybe even 319 if it was a larger scale project in multiple neighborhoods. You know, these scenarios don't quite capture every part of it, but thinking on a whole holistic scale, those are the sources we identified as being best to fund this project. We also talked about some beneficial points to include in the grant would be green infrastructure and youth engagement. That these are up and coming, priorities for funding streams, and ones advocates are certainly trying to get the agencies and others to move towards. And we also talked about there being multiple funding sources is helpful in funding a project, and also the need for maintenance after the project. So we said maintenance is kind of like monitoring in grants, that it's not often funded. And so reaching out to community groups is helpful to maintain the project. And then talked about a couple projects that are going on in Akron and Cleveland around CSOs, consent decrees, and also through the Ohio Lake Erie Commission Thriving Community Grant, including some points Emily brought up, stipends to volunteer youth for rain gardens. So those were just a couple points we touched on. Not sure if there's someone who wants to go next.
Yeah, Emily, I'll go next. So our group picked scenario A. A township wants to restore a degraded wetland to reduce flooding and improve habitat. They have community support but limited technical capacity. So for this, we decided on this one because we had some soil and water people in our group, and that's one of the scenarios that we see frequently. We figured that we could get a funding source through 319 or potentially through GLRI. Additionally, we could maybe go the state route through H2 Ohio funds, but we would have, depending on where this township is, we might have competing grant applications with the Western Basin. So that might not be the best funding source for that, depending on where we're at. When it comes to the timelines, it really depends if we were picking 319 or GLRI. We would have to follow the state or the federal timelines for that. And then, some things to add to the project to really solidify getting that funding would be water quality benefits, water quantity benefits, improved habitat, and community access. So that's what we had for whatever group we were. I think it was 3.
Thank you. I'd add maybe even the Army Corps for ecosystem restoration, essentially, but great report out. Good thinking on H2 Ohio. Is there another group you'd like to share?
Yeah, I guess I could run in there. Our group chose scenario E. A community group wants to restore a small urban stream and create a public access trail. So we really didn't come up with a great source of funding, but it all depends on the size, I think. Most of the time, if it's just a trail, questions came up is like, okay, well, who owns the land? And would there be a grant where some type of place where we could actually purchase the land to put that trail in along the stream for that? So that might be a hindrance to that. But so the size of the grant might be important to look at. If it's just putting a trail in by itself, or are we going to try to do some restoration in that to bring in preserving the entire stream valley? So then it would probably, I guess, a Clean Ohio grant or a Great Lakes Restoration grant for that purpose. So the making it a multi-purpose grant where it's putting a trail in and restoring the stream valley might get a bigger grant, but get the project done. And then finally, things that might strengthen that would be not only just looking at the trail and restoring the stream, but also documenting the total daily sediment load and how it's going to be reduced by that restoration to get you the funds. But one of the things we've seen is that these multi-purpose uses where the grant is going to be making a reconnected floodplain that's going to be storing stormwater, that's restoring the stream banks to reduce the sediment load and make a public access trail would be probably a really good project to fund. Any comments?
Really creative thinking. I appreciate that. And I think also local foundations would be interested in funding these often. Looking to some of those smaller local groups as well. Any thoughts? Is there another group would like to share? Been all of our groups then. We all picked different scenarios. That was great.
We have a shared Laura. Laura, do you want to start off ours, or do you want me to start off with the scenario started popping up after we had already started the discussion?
Yeah, if you want to talk about the scenario, Ivanka, I'm happy to talk about the funding source and insight we had.
So the scenario that we looked at, we kind of saw it later on about permeable pavers, but we had talked about a community that's here in Garfield Heights, and so Garfield Heights has an area that is predominantly African American. About 21% of the community members live in poverty, but they also have an issue with flooding. They are part of the Tinkers Creek watershed, and so some of the things that we had discussed is around the possibility of having permeable pavers, doing some native planting there, and I forgot what the other one was. I wrote it down, I thought.
Rain barrels.
In the rain barrels. And so Laura's gonna take that part from there.
Yeah, so it was actually very similar to one of the scenarios, but we went through a few different funding sources, thinking of 319 or NCRF, but landed on the Sustain Our Great Lakes program. They funded permeable pavement in the past as long as there's a green component, seeing as how it's a one-to-one match. We were thinking maybe the sewer district could help provide that match. So that's what we were anticipating going for. And then an insight, well, actually two insights that our group had was to make the project stronger, more competitive, is demonstrating cross collaborations among several different agencies and how different aspects of the project could benefit different groups, and also transferability and being intentional about how you share the project beyond the actual implementation of the project, but sharing the results out and being intentional about how you do that. So that's what we came up with.
All great thoughts. Well aligned. Anybody else? Thank you so much for participating in this training and these breakout groups. I think we have some really lovely outcomes in this last portion, and please consider attending the other trainings as well. And I'll pass it back to our hosts.
Thanks, Emily.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, Emily. Laura, was there anything else you wanted to add before we move on to our next agenda item? Good to go. Okay. All right. Well, with that, I would like to welcome Elena Valzer from the Alliance for the Great Lakes, who's joined us today to share some updates and information around data centers and issues and policy updates that relate to Ohio. And we're really excited to have her today. She's going to give a presentation, share some information, and then we'd love to just open it up for a discussion, Q&A, and just an open discussion on how watershed groups can help our communities deal with this upcoming issue. So with that, I can hand it over to Elena Valzer. And Elena, I will make sure that you can screen share if you'd like to. Give me just a moment, make sure you're a co-host. Okay, so you should be able to share your screen now if
Okay.
you'd like to.
See if I can do that. Is that coming through?
I think it's just getting ready to show. It's thinking about it.
There we go. All good?
I just see Helena Belzer has started screen sharing. Double click to enter full screen mode.
Let's see.
Oh, I see it now. Do
Okay,
others see
great.
it?
Awesome. I'm seeing head nodding, so I'm gonna go ahead.
Okay, great.
So thank you so much for having me today. I'm the Senior Source Water Policy Manager for the Alliance for the Great Lakes. I think I've met some of you in different spaces and events and things. So, but thank you again for having me. I'm here because last August we put out this report called A Finite Resource: Managing the Growing Water Needs of Data Centers, Critical Minerals Mining, and Agriculture. And this report really looked at kind of the comprehensive increase in demand for Great Lakes water from these three sectors, right? Data centers, critical minerals mining, and agriculture. They're all kind of existing at the same time, and we thought there would be overlapping needs and demands of these different sectors. The one everyone wants to talk about and we'll spend all the time on today is data centers, of course, but I just want to give a nod that the report also addresses critical minerals mining, more of an issue for states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan that have nickel and copper for the materials that are needed inside the chips for data centers, and also for EVs, less of a transition to EVs now, but also to transition to green energy. And then for agriculture, we're seeing an increased trend in irrigation in the peak hot summer months, which also tends to be when data centers require more water for cooling. And the potential for that to conflict with the needs of data centers is something we found that is very real. So most recently, and I believe Kim might have shared with you all that we put out a regional playbook for communities that are facing data centers. And the playbook is a follow-on of our report. What I heard after the release of the report was a real need from communities on how do we respond to these types of proposals. So I met with a number of community-based organizations and state advocates to learn what would be helpful as a resource and as a guide. It really, continues upon this idea that the Great Lakes system is an interconnected freshwater system that treats both groundwater and freshwater as one resource. And the Great Lakes Compact, which the Alliance has a long history of working on, really treats them both as one resource as well. The other thing that emerges is this idea of cumulative effects necessitating not only a need for a local approach, but both a state and regional approach, and how do we coordinate all of that. Finally, just a note on speed, both the speed with which data centers are being developed throughout the region and then the rate at which policymakers are trying to respond to both proposals and with policy at the state level is incredibly fast. And so I'll cover some of that later in what's been developing in Ohio recently on this front as well. So I like to start with this map just to ground us in where data centers are located. You'll see this clustering effect that tends to happen around major metropolitan areas. You can really clearly see Data Center Alley there in Virginia, it's kind of a straight line. But Ohio and Illinois, for some perspective, Illinois is 4 and Ohio is 5 in terms of the number of data centers that we have in the country. And this clustering effect tends to happen around cities because this is where there's access to transmission lines for energy, as well as low latency for internet speed. But increasingly, we're seeing them move out into rural areas, and particularly with the hyperscale facilities that need many acres, you'll see some of them expanding out there and building out their own natural gas generation even there as well. I like to include this slide just to say that not all data centers are the same. We're going to focus mostly on the hyperscale facilities. These are the large scale facilities operated by big tech and generally doing AI and generative AI really have the highest resource needs. But just to acknowledge that they're not all the same, and the playbook will also kind of cover the different types that exist out there. When it comes to hyperscale data centers, what's really driving the demand is this generative AI that requires this vast data processing that only the hyperscale facilities can handle. For perspective, in the Great Lakes region, the Weldon Cooper Center out of University of Virginia did some recent analysis on economic and fiscal impacts of data centers and found the average data center in the Great Lakes region is about 325,000 square feet, almost 50 megawatts of load, about the size of 1/3 of Millennium Park in Chicago. And then if that data center is using evaporative cooling, it can use between 1 to 5 million gallons of water per day. To put that in perspective a little bit, over the course of the year, that's equivalent to about what 12,000 Americans use in that time. We know they can use a variety of different cooling methods. Evaporative cooling has really the highest direct water usage, high consumptive use, but is more energy efficient. Some of these other methods, liquid immersion direct to chip, doesn't involve water. It directly immerses equipment in a dielectric fluid. And then closed loop, increasingly, we're seeing a shift from some of the major players to this method, uses less water and combines that water with coolant and delivers it to server racks to bring down the temperatures that way. It does have lower water use, but I'll show in an additional slide how this can still use a lot of water indirectly and because of the substantial energy use. And then finally, there's air cooling, which is really just large fans and on its own is really insufficient to sustain the needs of generative AI. I like to include this slide just to show the trade-offs between energy and water consumption. This is from Water Environment Federation. So you can see, as you get better water efficiency, you get less power and vice versa. So just kind of showing that there's a sweet spot there in the middle. So to put that in perspective, that indirect water usage, about how that can still be substantial, one of our partner organizations, Clean Wisconsin, did this really excellent analysis trying to estimate with best information available what that impact might be. And so this Port Washington data center is going to be 3.5 gigawatts at full build out, really, really huge. They didn't have any information about seasonal variation or hourly usage, so they're assuming 24/7 operation. But you can see here, based on these figures, that the numbers are kind of staggering. If we take the fact that they'd have to have 54 million gallons a day of water from a natural gas facility, that's about almost the equivalent of what a million Wisconsinites use, and more than twice every home, business, and manufacturer in the city of Green Bay. I include this slide. We're obviously not as involved on the energy side of this issue, but just to give you a perspective on how the energy needs are also soaring. This is again from UVA's Weldon Cooper Center. By 2027, Columbus is going to be the #2 metro site in the region after Chicago and ahead of New York. And in the most conservative scenario that UVA did, by 2040, Ohio's data centers will use all of the power produced by the 3 major power plants in the state. So you can see the different forecasts there, but the line is going up, right? The main problem, though, and the gap that we have is we don't understand what the total water use footprint is of a data center. Unless the data center itself withdraws water, the registration and consumptive use permit requirements we have don't apply. So there's no reporting requirements on water use when users are hooked into municipal water systems, and 97% of data centers are in this situation. Because there's no requirements to do so, less than a third are even tracking how much water they use. And I touched on this concept of the water energy nexus, right? We also need water to cool power plants when we're talking about fossil fuels or nuclear, and we can't calculate how much of that water use right now is being driven by data centers specifically. And then finally, non-disclosure agreements are really common in economic development, but when it comes to data centers, they're also being used to obscure how much water and energy is proposed to be used at the outset of siting a project, which could make forecasting demand pretty challenging. So we got involved in this work because of our history of working on the compact. As I said at the top, most people know that it generally prohibits diversions of water out of the Great Lakes Basin with some limited exceptions. But it also requires the states to manage their Great Lakes water use, to have conservation and efficiency programs, and to follow some common water use reporting protocols into a regional database so we can get a picture of Great Lakes water use. And we pull this phrase out of the compact because this is really the case that both our report and the playbook try to make, is that the programs were never meant to be static. The compact was agreed to back in 2008, and really those programs haven't seen too much adjustment since then. But they're meant to adjust to new demand and the potential impacts of cumulative effects and climate. I want to give credit on this slide to one of our partner organizations in Minnesota, Freshwater, for the content. But this is a typical development process of a data center, right? The economic development teams are involved in siting the project. And at this phase, the water managers and planners aren't really being involved. And then next, the community will be approached on primarily land and power needs. Non-disclosure agreements come into play here, and then there'll be a short timeline in which to make a decision. An agreement will be reached 9 times out of 10. It's a municipal water supply connection. And then here, finally, at the end, we'll have concerns being raised by the public and legislators and water managers. And this is why I think we've seen the sort of backlash and rejection to a lot of the data centers development across the region right now. Just this fact that the public is kind of the last to know in this development process. So in addition to water, we know that there's a threat to groundwater integrity, but we looked at some other environmental and community impacts in the playbook. We've seen the rise in electric utility rates, and we believe there's potential for this to occur with water and wastewater rates as well if communities aren't savvy and kind of negotiating for that infrastructure during the siting process. I heard from one community in Ohio that was experiencing water pressure drops, which because the data center was drawing water in such large batches, was stressing the water mains, causing water main breaks, and then introducing additional contamination. So you can see how the water infrastructure and wastewater rates might trickle down to consumers if that's not being considered. Noise, air, and light pollution, both from the data center itself and then the diesel generators that have to be there in order to provide power 24/7. Those generators can't sit idle all year long. They have to be fired up, and that can contribute to some of that noise and air pollution that we see. And then electronic waste. Inside the data center, the servers are being replaced every 3 to 5 years, so that can strain local landfills if that's where that's ending up being disposed of. And then fire risks. Most data centers have really complex fire suppression systems. So it's not to say that they aren't prepared for fire, but what we found in our research is really that this can strain emergency services regardless. There can be a number of emergency service calls. And particularly in rural areas where you have maybe village fire departments without these resources, if this isn't negotiated for or included in some way, this is something that could really strain communities. Ultimately, data centers generate really low direct employment, and most jobs that are generated are in the construction sector in exchange for really high resource usage. So for that reason, we included in our playbook kind of a community checklist. This is just a snapshot of kind of the water questions that can be asked. Both either, you could go to a community local elected official and ask, what's your policy on data center siting? Does it include these items? Or even take this list, when you're involved in a particular proposal and ask these types of questions, right? What's the water source? How much water? What kind of water quality? What's the source? All those kinds of questions are included in the checklist. There's a lot that can be done locally, and so one of the main challenges I mentioned at the top is the lack of transparency. So in terms of requesting documents, there's resources in the guide for making public records requests in order to obtain some of that information. We also have a guide for community benefits agreements. These are agreements between the community and developer as sort of a checklist of what can be included in those types of agreements to ensure some benefits come back to the community. There's also examples of municipal ordinances and zoning laws, as well as temporary moratoria, which is something that communities are starting to enact now. I'm sure the number is more now, but at last I checked that there are at least 18 Ohio communities that have imposed some kind of moratoria at some point. And then there's some information about, if you're participating in a local hearing or a meeting on a data center proposal, how to come prepared for that, and then responses you might encounter, in terms of asking questions, you may hear an answer and how to kind of respond to that on the fly. I also address in the playbook sort of why local solutions on their own aren't quite enough to address the scope and scale of this problem. I started at the top with kind of this idea of cumulative effects based on this threat to groundwater integrity. We already have existing groundwater conflicts in the Great Lakes region. There's also this water energy nexus that I talked about in terms of the indirect water usage. And it's really tough for communities to consider the increase in water usage at a power plant that may be totally outside their jurisdiction. We also know that state-level economic development corporations might make decisions without any local input at all. And then as local communities impasse moratoria or restrictions, that can kind of create a patchwork that pits communities both against one another. And community benefits agreements are one of those tools that can kind of alleviate that. But as those restrictions and moratoria come out, the state legislature may respond. And Ohio actually has a bill right now, HB 392, that proposes to severely limit local and state control over data center regulation. We provided some opponent testimony on that bill, but this was actually enacted in Montana. It would make it much more difficult, essentially, for local and the state government to enact any regulation over data centers. So for that reason, we have a number of policy solutions at the state level that we recommended in our report. Number one of those being more regional demand studies and groundwater mapping. Ohio's really done well on this front so far. It published this Central Ohio Regional Demand Study that you're seeing here on the screen, which identifies some gaps in capacity at 2030, 2040, and 2050 that communities in the Central Ohio area will be experiencing. But these kinds of studies really need to be incorporated as an ongoing part of these conservation programs versus one-time projects. They should also evaluate ecosystem and environmental needs as part of the demand figures, and this was something that the Central Ohio study did not do. They're moving on to do Southwest Ohio next, and we're hopeful that will be included. But without involving those factors, right, we're getting a kind of a sort of inaccurate picture of demand when it really comes to it. And then the whole point of these studies is that the economic development corporations and local governments could turn to them to decide, where to site a data center. The location of the data center really does matter when it comes to water resources because you can have more or less water resource impact based on location. Transparency and accountability, right? We talked about that challenge, disclosure and water use reporting requirements for large water users, irrespective of that water supply connection. New Jersey and California are two states that have tried to do this recently. Both efforts were vetoed by the governors in those states. And then community benefits agreements, we mentioned those to involve the community in the decision-making process from the outset, can help alleviate some of the pushback and moratoria that we've seen. And then finally, tax incentives and abatements. Those could be completely eliminated in our view or connected with water use in some way. Ohio's proposed, doing this basically in the last budget bill. It was enacted, and then the governor vetoed that provision, which would have eliminated the tax incentive for data centers specifically. And the legislature has had some conversation about coming back to override that veto, and we'll see how that unfolds the rest of the before June here at the end of the session. And then finally, conservation and efficiency standards for data centers that don't silo kind of water and energy efficiency. And Connecticut had a piece of proposed legislation on this that I thought was interesting, kind of proposing a study on this very issue. But the fact is that data centers don't have to use potable, finished, treated drinking water that consumers are using. They could be recirculating water, co-locating with a wastewater treatment plant, or reusing non-potable water. And that's something Ohio's looking at as well with a chapter of the Ohio Water Reuse Association, which is looking at ways to bring more non-potable water reuse online. I want to spend some time looking at state bills that have popped up in Ohio recently, and some other activities that have been going on in this sphere, since you're all interested kind of in what's been going on here. This past December kind of was the comment period. We participated in a public comment period. The Ohio EPA proposed issuing a general NPDES permit for data centers, which would allow them to directly discharge into Lake Erie and other streams and rivers. EPA received over 7,500 comments in response to this permit, so they're still navigating those comments and will be providing responses. So that was, of course, we provided some comments in opposition to that permit, and we'll see how that unfolds. But essentially, that would be one big general blanket permit the data centers could apply for coverage under, and really contain very little in the way of monitoring requirements or effluent limitations. So really hard to understand why Ohio EPA wanted to issue that general permit. These other pieces of legislation are sort of actively moving. I mentioned already the main budget bill with the sales and use tax incentive repeal. There's that conversation about overriding that veto of the governor's. Some of these other pieces, 646 is a data center study commission, which I have likely to be enacted by the end of this month. I'm still, I might stick to that. I don't know, maybe early April, we'll see. It's already through the House, and it would propose kind of a study to study the environmental impacts as well as other impacts of data center development, appoint some experts to do that study. And I think we'll see that one enacted. House Bill 695 is proposed by two Republicans that would flat out prohibit all non-disclosure agreements, not just for data centers, but in any kind of sphere. So very interesting bill there. And then another one, House Bill 710, would prohibit all public support, state and local, for data centers, and kind of limit data center construction away from what's defined as prime farmland. And that's sponsored by two Republicans. Then there's also a suite of Democratic bills that have been proposed, including one that would require some water use reporting and prohibiting consumptive use above 5 million gallons per day, and then several that kind of reaffirm the concept of home rule when it comes to regulating data centers. So we're working on leading a convening of state level partners across the region who are focused on this issue, engaging in data center advocacy. I mentioned the playbook several times that we've just released, and we're also working on educating lawmakers across the region about the policy recommendations that we've made. These are just some working groups that I participate in: the Water Reuse Association, the Ohio chapter, Michigan's Water Use Advisory Council, and the Great Lakes Compact and regional body meetings, for which we are an advisory member. So number one thing you can do is subscribe to our newsletter at greatlakes.org. You'll receive our action alerts about what we're doing across the Great Lakes region. But sharing the playbook with communities that are facing these large water use proposals and educating local and state elected officials about, proper surface and groundwater management is one of the key things that folks in this organization, I think, can do. And participating in providing testimony for hearings on data center legislation. Some of those bills that I mentioned are moving very, very quickly. Everything in this space will move very fast. And so if you're interested in that kind of activity, definitely keep in touch. My email is here on the screen, and I'm happy to help with any of those kinds of advocacy things. You can learn more about us and the increasing demand for Great Lakes water at our website, greatlakes.org/water use. The report is there. as well as a fact sheet, a prior webinar I gave, and then the playbook itself will be there as well. So that I'll take any questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Elena. Do you think we have a question in the chat about what organization you mentioned the regional demand studies, and just do you know which organizations have been leading those?
Yeah, that the Central Ohio Regional Demand Study was an effort between Ohio EPA, Ohio DNR, and MORPC, the Regional Planning Commission. It's my understanding the South, I'm not sure who is running the Southwest study, but they were funded through the Ohio Water Development Authority, is my understanding.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I see a question about House Bill 392. It's called the Ohio Right to Compute Act. And my concern with that bill was the broad language that was being used to describe sort of what regulations would be allowed. The bill, I believe, is perhaps geared at regulations regulating what the actual large language models and like what the AI is actually doing. But in that process, the way that they described what would be allowed and not allowed was to say that no regulation, any regulation had to have a compelling government interest and be narrowly tailored to that interest. And that's a really high bar for local governments to meet. The normal standard is just a rational basis test. Is it reasonably related to what the government is trying to do? So the fear there is that with any, let's say a local community, that bill was enacted and a local community wanted to enact a zoning ordinance or something, would it pass muster? Would it have a compelling government interest? And might the communities feel like, well, we can't pass any kind of ordinances or moratoria because of this bill for fear of getting sued, right? If they violate that prohibition, then perhaps it'd have a chilling effect on communities that want to take some kind of action. So that was really the concern, is just that really broad language being used there. Yeah, Meg.
Oh, it looks like Meg Hennessy with Cuyahoga Soil and Water has her hand raised, and then I have a follow-up question.
Okay.
Hi, yeah, I'm Googling some of the bills that you shared. Thank you for these updates. And I've just noticed something about this Ohio Enact the Right to Compute Act.
Yeah.
There's also the House Bill 710 that you mentioned, which seems like it would prohibit or limit construction of new data centers, although I'm having a hard time, and I'm Googling it in the background and trying to see what it involves. But what I notice is this one seems to, like, it would limit construction of new data centers, but it has one of the same primary sponsors as the Right to Compute Act, which seems
Yeah.
like they would be contradictory.
Yes. Yes, I found that very interesting as well. And all I can say is that I think that the hearings on House Bill 392 have stopped. It had 4 hearings, so I was a little concerned that it might actually move forward. But it has not had a hearing for quite a while, so I don't know if they've dropped that bill or what's going on with it. House Bill 710 has just been introduced and referred to a committee, which means that it will probably get some hearings soon. So we'll hear more about that one. But the way that in my brief review of the bill, that it limits that public financing. It limits the ability to provide public incentives, so local communities couldn't provide tax abatements, those kind of public financing for data centers to attract them in that way. And then there's some more provisions about location, about prime farmland and that kind of thing that I need to dig in a little further on that particular bill, but that's also there.
Interesting. So it seems like maybe this representative may have reversed course almost on data centers.
It could be possible, yeah, and that's how quickly things are moving in this sphere. I think the public response and reaction has drawn, in my experience, folks from both sides of the aisle to this issue. Right, I participated in a public town hall up in the Northwest Ohio a while back now, but just the public support for that event, and just the kind of seeing the folks that it drew out from both sides, right? It really is putting a lot of political pressure on legislators in particular. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And then I see some questions in the chat, but I think someone else was next, so I'm gonna take that first.
Oh, my follow-up question was actually whether there may be any additional opportunities to provide testimony on HB 392, but you said that hearings on it have stopped.
Yeah, I haven't seen a hearing for a while. It's got 4 hearings in the House. I would think that the next hearing would probably be just to, pass it out of committee. So I don't know if there will be another opportunity in the House, but I can definitely communicate with you all about if there's an opportunity in the Senate if it does pass the House to provide some testimony on that.
That'd be great.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And then someone mentioned water pollution, harmful chemicals relating to data centers, but there's not a mention of that in the handbook. Yeah, so that was one of the challenges, the playbook was already so large, and so we had to kind of figure out what we were going to address most. Data centers can have different types of cooling methods, as I mentioned earlier. And with evaporative cooling, that is probably the method that has the most wastewater discharge. Two-thirds of the water in that method is evaporated off. But one of the concerns when it does that process is that it can concentrate contaminants, for example. So there was a piece in the Rolling Stone a while back about a data center in Oregon that was intaking nitrate-laden water, and then through the process, right, evaporating most of that off, concentrating that nitrate, releasing it back, and then that water was then being used and really exacerbating a pre-existing nutrient problem. So that kind of contamination, as well as thermal pollution, is something when that water comes out, it is warmed. And one of our concerns with the Ohio EPA permit was there's a requirement to monitor temperatures, but no limit on thermal pollution really. So that's a concern of that water coming out warm. It can have impacts on harmful algal blooms, which we already have in Lake Erie, right? But then also can contribute to fish kills as fish get used to the warmer temperatures, and then that water stops. It can create shock and really harm ecosystems that way too. Other chemicals and things that not discharge wastewater can be things like corrosion inhibitors, biocides, things like copper and I believe nickel, part of that wastewater as well. With the closed loop systems, they use this combination of water and glycol, a coolant, and they take a lot of water up in that first fill up and then don't need to discharge that for quite some time. I'm not sure how that's being regulated and how that's being disposed of. I imagine because it contains that glycol, it has to be disposed of in a certain way. And so I think that would have to be in some kind of disposal well or something like that. So, but that's a great point. It does have an additional kind of concern there. And then PFAS are another contaminant, of course, that's been mentioned with respect to data centers, both in the evaporated vapor and then in discharge wastewater may also be a concern there too. And then next in the chat, we saw recently that rural communities have been working on legislation to stop data centers. Has there been work to make sure that the same legislation is in urban communities? I haven't seen that. Is this a constitutional amendment? Let's see. I know a number of communities have imposed those temporary moratoria that I mentioned. This is the first I've seen of this constitutional amendment effort. But just to show you, yeah, the date on this is March 16th. I was on vacation last week, but how quickly things can really move in this sector. So I will definitely take a closer look at this. Thank you for bringing that up. And the high costs being passed on to local communities through utilities and the burden on communities. That is something that I mentioned the water and wastewater rates. We really focused on the water side of the issue. The utility costs are something that is sort of being addressed, I believe, through PUCO. There is a data center tariff, and then there's a requirement that they also must pay, I think it's 85% of any new infrastructure substation that they need to expand. So that is one way that it has been dealt with on the utility side. But absolutely, there's potential for those water rates to increase as well. And there's a new study out that also talks about kind of that peak usage when they draw water at peak times. And I mentioned that one example from an Ohio community that experienced that firsthand. But unless communities are aware of the fact that there will be these peak moments in time when they need max capacity, that's something that has to be factored into discussions.
Alina, you may have already spoken to Ebony's comment there about work being done around cumulative issues like approvals for air, water, and energy before projects move forward. I was wondering if you could speak to that question a little bit.
Yeah, so there's a number of different, permits that might be needed depending on the facility, right? For air permitting, it's my understanding, just because I'm not an expert on the air side, that the diesel generators aren't required to have air permits because they are considered backup power. But and that has caused some issues in other places. I know, like in Tennessee, there's been a lot of litigation and consternation about a data center there that's using methane turbines and kind of got through with this loophole exception under the backup power kind of element there. For water and what we learned through the process of providing comments on the Ohio EPA permit is that most of the data centers in central Ohio are connecting to the wastewater treatment plant. And so when they do that, they're subject to some pre-treatment standards. They have to treat that water a little bit before they can send it down to the wastewater treatment plant, and that's very locally controlled. And so therefore, if you look, there's no individual NPDES permits been issued, to my knowledge, for data centers to discharge their water yet. So that's why it's really interesting that Ohio EPA was considering issuing this general permit, because it would mean that they could directly discharge without having to go through those pre-treatment standards. And so, I think it's all very case specific about what kind of permits they need. Stormwater and construction permits might also be needed. And then on the energy side, I'm just not as familiar to be able to speak to what might be needed there. And it would also depend on kind of what they're building and in that realm. Let's see.
Great. Lynn, I had a quick question. I really appreciate your recommendations for next steps we can take. I know as a network, this has been, a topic at our network meetings for many, many months now, and we're wanting to know, like, what can we do as watershed organizations, soil and water conservation districts, and so I appreciate your recommendations about, signing up for updates through the Alliance and sharing the playbook with communities. And then I just wondered if you had any insight on, how groups like ours can help communities with, even siting decisions or helping to reduce environmental and health impacts of data centers if they are, approved and moving forward in one of our communities.
Yeah, I think definitely like bringing some of those questions that are in the checklist to local elected officials and saying, what is your policy on, if data center comes to town? I think that's a really like neutral way to have that kind of conversation about, are you thinking about these things, right? And what I've found so far is no, if you in that development process timeline, water regional managers and planners aren't really being consulted. And so I think hearing from soil and water conservation districts that, yeah, we're concerned about water withdrawals, we're concerned about how this would impact water supply, I think could be really valuable, even if there's no data center proposal at issue, but just being aware that these are things you need to be thinking about during the process if you're even entertaining the possibility of siting one of these facilities. And then if one is proposed, right, and there's an active one, I think it's about what kinds of terms can you include in a community benefit agreement? What can it bring back to the community in exchange for this really resource intensive use and how it would impact these watersheds, I think would be helpful to hear from. And then we've heard, that the Ohio Farm Bureau, for example, or Farm Bureau in general, the entire Farm Bureau has a policy on data centers, and is concerned about the water usage. As I brought up at the beginning in our report, we address how, with climate change, we're seeing more drought, more hot, dry summers, and that's increasingly causing farmers to turn to irrigation. And during those peak summer months, that really could come into conflict with the needs of data centers. And one of the things is that we found in the report is really the law governing groundwater withdrawals just says everyone has right to make reasonable use of their groundwater. And that's really sorted out in the courts by a judge who may not have the expertise in in water to really decide, who is making reasonable use of the water. And so there's also a need for some of those groundwater conflict laws to be updated and revised as well, so that the state ODNR, which oversees that withdrawal registration process, can maybe weigh in a little bit more as to what is a reasonable withdrawal rather than having to fight that out in the courts when there are groundwater conflicts. And that can be very complicated and challenging to do, but that was one of the flags that we also raised, is that the groundwater management laws aren't really prepared to deal with an increase in conflicts if that does occur. So let's see. Yeah. Yeah, the speed with which this is going, I think there's a lot being built out, and there's some speculation in this market too. I mean, and that is another thing that I think communities need to be aware of and kind of negotiating for when considering these proposals that maybe is not quite addressed in the playbook, is that if the whole thing goes belly up, how do you ensure that the benefits will still come back to the community? And I heard from one community in Ohio that talked about, that's how we do payment in lieu of taxes. We accept, we abate taxes, but then the data center is required to pay this big lump sum up front, which we can put back into our community services, into our schools. And that helps them hedge a little bit in case the whole thing goes belly up and they are then stuck with a giant concrete warehouse if the data center, industry kind of folds. But I don't think that's on the horizon. I know there's been some talk about that, and it is very speculative. They are building these things faster than they can really fill them. Some of the retail data centers are, don't even have tenants yet. But I do think that the trends, right? I showed the trend of the energy consumption. They aren't really reflecting that so far.
Right. In the chat, I think we have a question from Meg about House Bill 706 and some
Yes.
information there. Wondered if you knew more about
I'm
that.
not as familiar with this one. I think this one is more squarely on the energy side, and this really reflects how how energy and water advocates really need to work together in this space because we can't be as siloed as we have been in the past. But let's see, would it ensure costs of new infrastructure and grid upgrades need to serve that these facilities are not shifted onto Ohio ratepayers, would require long-term service agreements of at least 12 years with electric utilities, and prohibit utilities from recovering data center costs from other customer classes. I think this, if I'm not mistaken, this tends to codify what I was saying that the PUCO had already done with the tariff and the new infrastructure payment requirement. So I think this is kind of putting that into law, which is great. But I think it's kind of codifying what already exists. But this is exactly the kind of thing that we would also want to see in the water and wastewater space, right? Ensuring that those kinds of costs aren't being shifted onto ratepayers.
Great. I know, Helena, well, thank you so much for that information. Want to pause in case people have more questions that they want to ask, but I know that you're off to another presentation here shortly, Elena, so we especially appreciate you joining us given your back-to-back presentations. But do we have any other questions for Elena? And we can also, we do have our meeting until 12. If Elena needs to hop off, we can still continue our discussion if folks want to hang
Yeah.
on. But
And feel free also, as well to email me if you have questions afterwards. That's totally fine. My email is hfolzer@greatlakes.org.
Great. Any final lingering questions while we have Helena with us?
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you again, Elena. And feel free to stay on as long as you can or want to, but feel free to hop off if you need to. And we'll wrap up our meeting here shortly. Great. If you have any other questions for Elena, we can make sure her email is included in the follow-up. And then we also have some data center resources that we've been gathering and want to just pop these in the chat too. I think a few of you on this call have shared these, so thanks to everyone for getting these resources compiled. Did anybody have any other thoughts about the data center discussion and things that watershed groups and saltwater conservation districts and other entities doing watershed work can do in this space? Might just be a lot of information right now that we need to chew on. So we can make sure that we include, we'll ask for Elena's slides and see if we can include those in the follow-up.
I'll just note that I do think that Helena's point about information coming out quickly is my experience too in this, that it feels like there's more and more and more to keep track of at all times. And so I think that it can feel overwhelming. And one thing that I don't see in the data center resources that I was just alerted to last week was that Policy Matters Ohio is putting together kind of a listserv for a statewide strategy. And so that might be something that we investigate as a collective to see. And the other resource that I was just turned on to is that the Joyce Foundation has a kind of a bi-weekly Great Lakes wide resource that they're sharing. That's kind of best practices from, or it's kind of updates and best practices that they're seeing from across the Great Lakes. But yeah, to the point of information overload and overwhelm. There's a lot out there.
Thanks, Emily. We can make sure the Joyce Foundation's biweekly resources in the Policy Matters listserv are in the follow-up. Thanks for sharing those. Great. Any further thoughts?
I think the other thing was I put something, in the chat at that time about this whole thing around rural communities and that rural communities had come together in order for them to combat some of the things that were going on around data centers. But I looked at it and, I reached out to the legislators that I know and said, okay, well, if rural communities are doing it, we definitely need to make sure that urban communities, particularly in Northeast Ohio, which will be disproportionately impacted, also. And so we know that right now, the IX Center is slated to become a data center, and we should be protesting that like crazy. Like we should be absolutely saying we do not want the IX Center to be a data center. Because it serves no purpose for the community. So when she talked about like jobs, zero job creation. And so remember how they have been doing this is that it's going to create all these jobs. Besides the retrofitting of the building, there are literally no jobs. You just need one person to open up the building and the other person to close it down. Like there after they build, there is nothing, no jobs that are available to the community. But then you think about the literal millions and millions of dollars of tax breaks that these companies, multi-billion dollar industries, are getting off the backs of poor people in the state of Ohio. And this is ridiculous. And so when you look at the number of data centers we have here in Ohio right now is 217 and counting. But when you look at nationally across the United States, we have like almost 6,000 data centers in the United States. The closest country after us only has like 500. Why do we have so many data centers in the United States? And so that's, and when you look at the money that's being given away to people who have resources, and then you're taking the natural resources that we have in our communities and literally robbing us of the things that we have. And poor people are going to be disproportionately impacted. That is the issue that I'm having with all of this.
That's really well said, Ivanka. Do you happen to know where that decision process is right now at the IX Center? I should probably know that with the news or but maybe you've been following that more
They
closely.
don't really want to tell you about it. I knew only because I've been doing some research about it, and I'm like, okay, well, where are we at in this? And so every time I talk to council people or county council, they're like, yeah, we're working on it. It's like, no, we don't want you to work on it. Like, we want to work you on closing it. Like, figure out something else to do with that space, but not a data center. Like, it's other things that we can have. But and when we talked about the impact around with regular factories, we see the smokestacks. And so we know that the emissions are coming from the smokestacks. So data centers, although they don't have smokestacks, they have emissions that are coming from them. And so those are the toxins that are being emitted into the communities that are there. And so think about the people who live right there in that Cleveland area, who live along the area of Berea, who live in North Royalton, who live right there in that epicenter of the IX Center and how those communities will be impacted. I don't think people really understand their risks. They just think like computer knowledge, computer generated knowledge, great thing. Not understanding the whole risk around the environmental impactors. What's going on with your air, your land, and your water as a direct result of having data centers in your community.
Mhm. Yeah, go ahead, Abby.
So I've also heard some interesting things about how NASA has protocols in place about like recycling wastewater a lot. And, if that were something that the data centers could do, it would prevent a lot of the natural resource drain that they can cause. And I didn't know if anybody had heard if that is part of any of the bills that are, or, regulations that are being proposed right now about reducing the just the draw because, like Ivanka was saying, this is going to impact everyone directly around it. And if all the water resources are being pulled to it, and energy resources, it's going to be super detrimental. So I didn't know if anybody had heard anything about the possible regulations of limiting the draw by gray water management.
I haven't heard anything specific to the legislation that Helena shared, but I do know that Ohio joined that Water Reuse Association, that's national, and that there was work that was happening under the prior Ohio EPA director, Ann Vogel, who's now moved up to US EPA Region 5, um, in that water reuse space. So I think that um, that's the latest I've heard on it. It doesn't mean that that's the end all be all. I think that it's a question worthy of asking, and I also think that with all of the data center legislation that we saw Helena share, uh, that's happening, I think that there's probably an opportunity to say, hey, can we talk through this too? Would be my guess. But that Ohio, like, or joining the Water Reuse Association, I think Ohio is one of the only states in the Great Lakes who's joined into that. And it's I think well known in some of the drier states
Okay,
across the United States.
thank you.
I have a question. Is this more of a planning and design issue where we need to locate these facilities where we have alternative water sources and maybe require them to have something like a constructed wetland that's cleaning the water afterwards? Are there creative ways that we could be directing water sources and water discharge to make it more environmentally palatable?
Yeah, what do folks think?
One of the things I would like to look into a little bit more, I'm still kind of digesting all that information Helena provided, but she spoke about another state that was requiring use of non-potable water, and then also like the idea of closed loop systems. But then I think also bringing up that there's still like that doesn't take away the energy intensiveness of that type of development, but that is a way to maybe deal with some of the concentrating of contaminants and how are you treating that and preventing it from getting into rivers. Um, so I think it was Vermont that she mentioned. It was Vermont, either Vermont or Connecticut. And I did want to just note that we recorded both of these sessions here this morning, and we'll make sure that these get onto the Networks box account. So if anyone wants to go back and as well as sharing out, I believe, is that the plan, Laura and Kim, to share out the slides as well. So if, I know that there was a lot of information there, and I'm planning to kind of go back and look at some of the examples that Helena was talking about as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you for those questions and comments. If there's more, feel free to raise your hand or pop it in the chat. But this will remain a topic on our future meetings as we continue to explore what groups like ours can do around this issue. Well, as we close up today, Laura's going to put in the chat the dates for the next advocacy trainings in partnership with Ohio Environmental Council. And also just wanted to quickly screen share our upcoming meeting dates. If you have any recommendations for topics for future meetings, I know the agendas for our next couple meetings are sort of in the works, but if you have suggestions, we'll see what we can do to fit them into those, or to make sure we get your suggestions fit into a meeting later in the year or something like that. So here are our next meeting will be May 19th, 10 to 1 p.m. in person. And then before that, we do have our next advocacy training that Laura popped in the chat. I believe it's April 20th. Is that right? Sorry, I'm not good at looking at two things at once here. Yes, April 20th, 1 to 3:30 p.m. So we hope you can join us for that. But anything else, any closing comments before we wrap up today? Yeah,
I guess one thing that I'm seeing, reading through some of these playbooks is if, especially as we're responding to some of these, many of the big producers like Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Google have committed to powering them with renewable energy sources, or being carbon and water positive, carbon negative, water positive, zero waste. I would say, I think the important thing to consider there is we've just seen how regulations and requirements on reporting of that are not strict enough for us to have confidence that they are. Like, some of them are already claiming that they have met those renewable energy goals, but without things like strict water requirements, we can't know for sure. Water reporting requirements.
That's a great point, Meg. Any other closing thoughts or reactions? Yeah. And thanks for the ongoing discussion in the chat about the Ag Center and the links. Be sure to follow that a little more closely now. Okay, well, we're almost at noon. We can hop off here unless there's anything else. Thank you again to everyone who joined us today. We really appreciate your time. All right, we'll see you next time.
Bye. Thanks.